Welcome to the Thinking the Unthinkable podcast, our latest leadership conversation. Hello, I'm Nik Gowing. In this podcast, there will be even more of a conversation. That's because of our recent podcast on the speed of transition from fossil fuels with Mark Campanale. It stimulated remarkable engagement. Mark is founder and director of the Carbon Tracker Initiative. He had 25 years in investment management. CTI is a non-profit think tank best known for its work on stranded assets and the carbon bubble. Based on CTI's analysis, Mark told me the oil age is ending. We're watching it shrink gracefully. It's a contraction by design going on. Fossil fuel producers are not doubling down on production. In fact, they are stepping back from energy growth altogether. Well, you can find Mark's precise remarks in the accompanying transcript on the Thinking the Unthinkable website. We then had an email from Sir Jeremy Greenstock. He's a former top British ambassador. He's now chair of Lambert Energy Advisory, which advises the upstream energy industry on strategy and transactions. Jeremy wrote to us criticizing Mark's argument as very partial, too simplistic, too categorical about the decline in oil demand. On wind and solar, Mark never mentioned the high degree of intermittency. Look at availability figures as opposed to installed capacity. So Jeremy made plenty of other points too. So we brought them together to discuss their differences. Jeremy, welcome. You wrote to us, Mark is right to point to a major transition going on, but his arguments are much too simplistic and you say very partial. Why?
Well, thank you for the invitation, Nick. It's great to be on this podcast with Mark. And I want to start by saying to Mark, I agree with a huge amount of what you're saying. There is a great transition going on. There is a huge decline in independent oil companies' investment in new fields. And therefore, we're on the cusp of something very important, which needs explaining to our TTU listeners. And I'm very glad to be in on this podcast with Mark to do that. Why I said it's simplistic and partial is for two main reasons. One, as I hope to explain in this conversation, is that although oil companies are not reinvesting in new fields enough to ensure the constant supply of oil at current levels, oil demand is not going down. It's risen by between 1 and 1.5 million barrels a day per year over the last 5 years, and it's forecast to go up further, up to and beyond 2030. And I think that hides something that Mark hasn't brought out in the earlier conversation. And my second big theme that I want to go over with Mark in this conversation is the cost of renewables and the speed of investment in new renewables supply, because I think he's hiding in his description of renewables investment the full term cost, i.e. the real life cost of renewable installations and supply. And we need to explain to our listeners exactly what those realities are in this conversation. So I'm very glad to get into this once Mark has explained his position.
Mark, would you like to respond to what Jeremy said?
I'm glad that we both agree that there is an extraordinary energy transition happening. The trend here is our friend. We know that the rise of renewable energy is displacing gas demand, particularly in Southeast Asia, because many of the countries, particularly China and India, are importing their fuels. They want energy security. They want to come off of energy imports, quite rightly, and that's behind the huge investments in renewables. Now, the question that I think that I'm being posed is it true to say that oil and gas demand is growing? Now, when we look at the amount of investment going into renewables, it is leading to demand destruction particularly for oil. And we're seeing that already in China. And if we just pick one example, Pakistan, they have installed the equivalent of 60% of their energy needs with solar in just 1 year. And they're cancelling around 2 LNG shipments, I think it's a month or a quarter, as a consequence. And demand for diesel is down 30%. So you can just see how quickly the energy transition is happening. And now if we extrapolate this out to multiple countries in the global south, many countries like China and India who have to import their energy, actually, I think we're underestimating the speed of this transition, not overestimating it. And it will feed through into falling demand for oil. In particular, the EIA, the International Energy Agency, thinks that current trends will lose around 5 million barrels of oil demand a day by 2030, thereabouts. And I think we're on the way to that being realized.
Jeremy, one of the things you said was that Mark is being too categorical about the decline in oil demand, which is central to so much of what we want to talk about. Why do you challenge him on that?
Well, let's have a look at some of the figures for current oil and gas demand and its share of total global energy demand. So could we look first of all at my slide 1 for electricity production and what goes into generating electricity around the world? Our listeners and readers will see that coal and gas are nearly half of electricity supply, and oil is a tiny proportion of that. And the element that non-hydrocarbon sources are providing is just over half and growing the whole time, but actually growing rather slowly in the solar, wind and other area in the top left-hand corner. These are the 2024 figures. If we look at slide 2, we can see that the total energy needs across the world goes far beyond just electricity production and includes nearly 55% of oil and gas at the moment, about 30% of coal. That's going beyond electricity, even because so much coal goes into steel and other forms of manufacturing. And if you leave nuclear and hydro aside for the moment, because there are old renewables as opposed to the new renewables, offshore and onshore wind is about 10%, solar is about 8%, and other bioenergy and biomass comes to about 13 million barrels a day equivalent. So divide by 3 for the percentage figures for the total. So much investment has gone into renewables so far, as Mark is explaining, but it's only so far provided about 10% of total global energy needs, way beyond electricity, because energy needs include all sorts of things that hydrocarbons are going into, like fertilizer for food, plastics, ammonia, concrete, steel, etc. And the IEA has been consistently overestimating, Mark just quoted the IEA figures, overestimating the degree of oil demand rise in the world. Our figures in Lambert Energy show that up to 2030, there's likely to be a continuing rise of around 1 million barrels a day beyond the 103 that you see for 2024. It's close to 105 expected in 2025. And the proportion of oil, gas and coal that's still going into the world's daily energy needs cannot be replaced by renewables at the speed that Mark is describing and expecting. It's just not possible with the supply of materials and capital and manufacturing capacity to expand that 10% in just a few years to take over more than half of the world's daily energy needs. So we need to understand that the world's energy actually needs both hydrocarbons and renewables for a considerable time to come. And I hope that it's going to be a fast transition to renewables, because we must get rid of carbon out of our systems. But the world's supply of materials for that transition is not going to come fast enough to knock out that huge 75% contribution of hydrocarbons that you see on this slide.
So, Mark, there's essentially agreement with you about the direction of travel, but not about the pace, and particularly about this problem of replacing. Yeah. What is your thought, and what is your argument in response to that?
Well, can we put slide 5 up, please? We just have to look at the capacity installation for renewable energy. And now solar, just solar alone, without incorporating wind and hydro, is now greater than gas and coal. Now, installation or capacity is not the same as final energy delivered, but there's one thing that Jeremy has not mentioned, which is that you don't need the same amount of energy from renewables to displace fossil fuels. And the reason for that is because of the combustion process is so inefficient. 65% of the energy is lost during combustion because of the physical inefficiencies of burning fuels, which there's a lot of waste heat which is not captured, and so on and so forth. So our friends at EMBA and other research institutes have calculated that you only have to increase global energy supply for electricity by between 10 and 15% to completely electrify the whole of the world's transportation fleet. And the reason for that is you've got very, very high efficiencies of energy conversion that happens when you're using electric vehicles and electrification across all kinds of devices, including for energy production like solar. And so it's the falling costs of renewables, which is a technology, plus its inherent efficiency, that means we can grow it very, very swiftly. You can't build a gas-fired power station or a coal-fired power station in the time that it takes to build solar. Solar, you can deliver far, far greater amounts of installed energy capacity. And just look at what Elon Musk did with a battery storage system in New South Wales a few years ago, where he built it in, 6 months, 9 months, many hundreds of megawatts of battery storage. And so you can just see that actually we can grow this, and it is being grown. I think China has delivered twice the amount of solar that it did just last year, just illustrating the speed of this and its ability to displace coal. So I think my response would be is that you don't need the same amount of fossil fuels to deliver the same amount of energy that you can get. Rather, you don't need the same amount of solar and wind to deliver the same amount of energy, because so much energy is lost through the combustion process. And also its cheapness, its cost and speed of deployment is why it's succeeding.
Jeremy, what's your response to that, using that graphic saying solar and batteries are taking over? In other words, there's a danger of underestimating or understating the enormity of the transition that's taking place.
There is an enormous amount being installed, but I think that Mark is underestimating the true cost of renewables, which need subsidies from governments all over the world to be provided at any sort of profit, and which are actually taking over much more slowly than he implies, for a very fundamental reason. Can I put up slide 5, please, which looks at the load factors for wind and solar, which means the amount that they are available to be used when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. This is for the UK, so it's good on wind and poor on solar, but it does illustrate my fundamental point that the capacity of new renewables like solar and wind, which is 100% on this slide, is not reached when the wind isn't blowing and so the sun isn't shining. And it varies very considerably at different times of the year. As you go through the quarters of the last 3 years, you can see how it goes up and down for both wind and solar according to the season. Offshore wind in the UK is the most efficient and sometimes has reached 50% of UK energy or electricity generation. We're only talking about electricity here, not the other forms of energy use which hydrocarbons are necessary for. And as an average for the UK, and in a sunny country with less wind, the green and the brown would be reversed. The total availability of these two sources of renewables is around between 20 and 30% at best at the moment. Now, batteries can indeed make up for that, but batteries take an enormous amount of manufacture, use up a lot of carbon in manufacturing, and they're not a carbon reducer at 100% of their installation. So there's something going on here. I agree with that, but it's not as dramatic and it's not as fast as Mark is implying. Let's take the instance of China, which is by far the biggest installer of solar and wind recently, as Mark has just implied. 65% last year of new wind installation and 60% of global solar installation. But these renewables are in particular geographies where the wind towers and the solar panels are placed, and the infrastructure for distributing their power to where it's used in homes, offices, factories, transport, etc., hasn't yet been built. And the trouble that the Chinese are having in building the infrastructure to distribute the renewables is illustrated by the fact that they can't get their provinces to agree on releasing their local solar and wind production into the national grid because they want it used locally. They haven't got the infrastructure yet built, and the Chinese are having to slow down their whole installation of solar and wind into the grid because they haven't got these things sorted out yet. If the world's primary investor in new renewables is having these problems, I hope we can get over them because we need these renewables to take carbon out of the system. I'm absolutely in agreement with Mark about that. But there are problems of cost, of infrastructure building, of delivery, which have not been accounted for in Mark's cost projections.
Mark, I saw you shaking your head quite vigorously several times in disagreement.
Well, obviously the world's most subsidized industry when it comes to energy is, of course, fossil fuels. The OECD has calculated that there's, $6-7 trillion of fossil fuel subsidies, which ultimately the consumer has to pay for. Actually, by and large, most of the world's renewable energy today is unsubsidized. So I'd have to disagree with you there, if I may, Sir Jeremy. When it comes to actually the grid, I think this is such an important point. What we're having to do to manage these new energy systems is reinvest in the grid, not just in the UK, but globally. But along with the reinvesting in the grid, we're going to have better grid management systems. And we're actually moving from a world where you've got centralized energy coming down the wire to your house. We're moving to a system where it goes two ways. The energy that's generated in the home makes its way into the grid. That's something that's never happened before. It's part of the energy revolution. And what that allows for is better and greater demand management and efficiencies in grid management that will reduce energy use. Now, I was listening to a podcast with Ed Crooks from Wood Mackenzie just the other day, and he had on a guest that was saying that you can install a solar panel for around 200 euros a kilowatt hour in your garden. You can produce your energy at around 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Using an inverter on the back, you can plug in to your house, upload your energy into the system, and the people selling you the energy back are selling it to you at 25 cents, thereabouts, a kilowatt hour. So this is driven by the economics. Households want to cut their energy costs, and they are doing this. They'll be putting solar on their roofs. they'll be generating their own energy, and this new energy system will be able to put energy back into the grid at the household level. Now, I think this is important, Nik. I'm not an investor in Octopus Renewables, but Greg Jackson, the CEO, has announced his 100,000 homes with free energy, new homes, by 2030. Now, what is he doing? He's putting batteries in the house, solar on the roof, air source pumps for your heating, and an electric car out at the front. And he's storing the energy in your car at night at this cheapest form and selling it when prices peak. And through that mechanism, he's promised you essentially you won't pay a bill ever again for your energy needs. Now, another person has calculated we only need something like 6 million EVs on the road in the UK to have created a parallel energy storage system at scale that grid managers, electricity companies will be able to draw on to meet some of our energy needs during times when, as you say, Sir Jeremy, when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining. We're building out our energy storage systems. That's an exciting development. You're right to say we're only at the beginning of this, but it's happening very, very fast. I think that intermittency problems will be met. I think the greater challenge, to, for example, the gas industry, which, as you know, is the reason why energy is twice the cost for consumers that it would be if we just relied on renewables, we can look forward to lower prices for consumers as renewables grow and as storage systems grow.
Now, Jeremy, one of the things you wanted to challenge was Mark being much too categorical, to use your words, about the decline in oil demand. One of the central elements of what Mark was and his colleagues have been arguing is the fact that what's hiding in plain sight, oil and gas companies are no longer growth players. They are pulling back and cashing out, and the market knows this now. Is that your assessment from Lambert?
Yes, absolutely, because the facts are there, and Mark is absolutely right on this. But it's going to lead to a very interesting new phenomenon, which Mark hasn't treated in his remarks so far, including in his earlier podcast with you. And that is that with the continuing oil demand, as I am arguing and Mark is not, but I think that the figures up to 2030 and beyond will prove me right on this, that oil demand will not fade as fast as he is saying. There's going to be a growing gap between world oil demand and world oil supply because the main oil companies, producing companies, are not investing in their new fields. And this will mean that although we're watching a decline in the oil price at the moment because the OPEC producers are increasing their production in order to win greater market share, and this is a political move by them at the moment, and of course a commercial and economic one, there is going to be a shortage of oil against demand in those areas where renewables are not taking up the slack from the move out of hydrocarbons.
Well, let me check that with Mark then, because one of the things you said very clearly when we had our previous discussion, oil companies are opting to shrink gracefully rather than overextend.
Well, Nik, you haven't actually let me finish my argument on this.
Please go ahead then, Jeremy.
Which is that oil companies are just now beginning to realize, with the advent of Trump and the change in policy in the US, and with the expectation that there will be an oil rise coming in the next 2, 3, 5 years because of the growing gap between supply and demand, that the oil price is going to rise and new fields are going to be worth investing in. And we're talking to our clients at the moment about where they should be reinvesting and how, and sensing a new interest in the oil companies, that there is a market to play for in the next 10 or 20 years before renewables are able to take over. And remember, renewables are mainly of interest in the electricity generation area. A lot of other parts of the energy needs of the world, transport and fertilizers and plastics and other refined products, are continuing to need hydrocarbons to supply them. And that gap is going to mean a rise in the price of oil and gas somewhere down the line, which China itself is beginning to invest in by buying up oil stocks at a greater level this year than ever before, which shows that they are seeing something coming down in the relationship between supply and demand, coming down the line, which will mean that oil and gas will be reinvested in the coming 5 years.
Mark, what's your response to that? Because what Jeremy seems to be saying is that there's a squeeze developing, which means that oil is going to be more at premium prices simply because it's become less attractive to invest until the price goes up. In other words, things are moving against what you've been saying.
Well, look, 70 to 80% of oil and gas needs is not for fertilizers and not for plastics. It's for burning in cars or in lorries. And that's the main market. And that's the market which, just a few years ago in the UK, EV sales were 1-2% of total car sales. Today, it's reached 34%. Last year, China, electric vehicles exceeded 50% of new car sales all over the world. Places like Nepal, Vietnam, you've got huge growth in the sales of electric vehicles. So I don't think that the demand that Sir Jeremy expects will come through from transportation fuels. And the reason for this is that consumers want to pay less. Running an EV, the total cost of building and running, just to challenge you on your earlier point, when you take in the all-in cost of electric vehicles and renewables, many studies have shown this is considerably lower than the all-in cost of fossil fuels, because you're not also not taking into account the massive damage to the environment of subsidized fossil fuels. If you had to pay the full cost of fossil fuels unsubsidized, it will be even more unaffordable than it's becoming today. As any buyer can go out, particularly in China, you can buy a cheap EV at $10,000-$12,000 list price, when the internal combustion engine is coming at a far higher at that, because it's just a more complicated piece of machinery to make and an even more expensive to run. So I mentioned.
Let me put to you, if I may, Mark, that it's not just about EVs and transportation. It's also about what Sir Jeremy has mentioned before: feedstock, fertilizer, cement, plastics, ammonia, healthcare products. In other words, those are demanding oil as well.
Look, Nick, in principle, I want to be clear. I don't have anything against the oil and gas industry. I just don't think we should be burning oil and gas. It takes millions of years for nature to create this. We'll look back and say, well, what do we do in a very narrow piece of human history, 50, 70 years? Well, we set fire to it instead of actually keeping it.
Let's keep the emotive,
more
the emotive language out of this, Mark. We're looking at the economics of this.
The reality, the combustion.
And you said both oil and gas.
Millions of years to make. We should be using it much, much more carefully than we are. You're right. We should be keeping it for things like complex pharmaceuticals, complex plastics. We should be keeping it and conserving it for future use, not liberally treating it as something that is infinitely replaceable when we know that it's not. And that's, and it's the combustion of it, the inefficiency that economists are pointing out. We've got a more efficient system, a clean energy system. It's more reliable. It's more efficient. It's cheaper. It's getting better and better. The more we build, the more we sell. And we should look back with fondly on the fossil fuel days, which are now behind us increasingly in many parts of the world, led by China and Southeast Asia, because they've discovered that the new technologies which are just better to run, better to operate. I mean, a car has many hundreds more operating parts than an electric vehicle, and that's why it's cheaper to maintain. And if you're making your own electricity, which people increasingly are, and you can store it, you're actually running your car on the electricity that you've made, and you're lowering the costs again. And that's the beauty of these new technologies.
Jeremy.
Making your own electricity is itself an absolutely tiny proportion of the energy supply around the world. You said oil and gas. at the beginnings of your remarks just now, there's a considerable difference between oil and gas in the way that they're used in the world's energy system. Now, this is 2024, and Mark is absolutely right. Things are changing quite fast, but there's an awful lot to get rid of in the supply of electricity if you remove coal and gas out of the system. And EVs, although they're more efficient, they're cleaner, everybody should be driving EVs if they can afford them across the world. They still need electricity in their supply. Their batteries have to be charged every few hundred miles, and at the moment nearly 50% of that electricity is coming from hydrocarbons. Also, in the supply of renewables, if you turn again to my slide 5, that gap between 50, 30, 20 and 100 has to be met for a consistent load which governments have to produce for the lights to be on all time, every day, 24 hours a day, through power station backup for renewables if they're no longer available for that moment. Increasingly, we hope, and Mark is right to be pointing to this, batteries will take up some of the supply load that's missing from the load factor in solar and wind. But for the moment, gas power stations are taking up an enormous amount of spare capacity to be used when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining. And that is part of the greater cost of renewables that I'm saying Mark has not covered in his remarks.
Nik, if I may, could we go to slide 3, please? Thanks, Nik. The main thing we've got to look at is the falling costs of renewable energy systems versus fossil fuels. And whilst this slide only goes up to around 2020, 2021, solar and battery storage have continued to fall below that of fossil fuels. So the main driver here is the cost of energy production. And if I may also switch, and what that shows you in the green is that it's actually renewable energy is by far and away the biggest source of energy growth by source. So what we've got is we have to look at the trend here. And whilst renewables continue to grow in size and scale and speed, they only have to continue to grow at this rate over the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years to rapidly displace fossil fuels. Now, let's take the 3rd, 4th largest economy in the world, which is California. And California is now running for a couple of days without burning any gas whatsoever because you've got huge battery installations in California, one of the world's biggest economies. And I think we just have to look at what they've achieved to show actually what can be done in most parts of the world. We're at this interesting kind of interregnum or period where change is rapidly happening, but we have to see what is emerging. And what I believe is emerging is the inevitable and rapid replacement of fossil fuels, particularly gas because of its expense, with clean energy alternatives. And the biggest concern that Carbon Tracker has of stranded assets is that the banks and investors are investing in new gas capacity or LNG capacity where demand actually won't come through. Because as we mentioned earlier, looking at Pakistan, they were able to install so much renewable energy in 1 year that they've been cancelling LNG ships and demand for diesel is down 30%. You'll see the same story multiply right across the global south and increasingly in the global north. And so all the shipping infrastructure, the pipelines people are investing in will just not deliver the return on capital that investors are expecting. And that's why we've seen a collapse in investment in more fossil fuels. And instead, investors have been attracted to the greatest certainty, particularly of policy from renewables. Now, I just had a very quick last remark. Governor Mark Carney, when he was leading the Bank of England, in his speech on the tragedy of the horizons, he introduced an interesting point. He cited Say's law that supply creates its own demand. And I think that actually it's the supply in many cases of oil and of gas that paradoxically creates its own demand. And we'll actually see it's the supply of renewable energy as other people see it and people can see their neighbors with it that actually spurs others on to demand renewables. And we'll see a switch from the fossil fuel gas and oil to the cleaner alternatives.
Now, Jeremy, maybe you could respond and maybe we could begin to bring this to some kind of conclusion. But I was very struck in our pre-discussion when you mentioned a particular book about how the world really works. So what is the trend that you are seeing, even if you agree with much of what Mark is saying and what Mark has been highlighting, the detail is significantly different about how the world is really working?
Yes, this book, How the World Really Works by Václav Smil, who is not a lobbyist, he's a professor and a scientist, explains what actually happens in the energy world up to the moment that he wrote the book 2 or 3 years ago. So he's not up to date with all the things that are happening in new technology of renewables, but it is a wonderful read as to how the world actually supplies and uses its energy, and it explains to a great extent why the demand for oil and gas is going to continue to hold. Mark, I'm going to take issue with one more thing in what you're saying, and then I'll sum up in where we agree more than where we disagree. In the falling costs of solar and wind, and particularly solar, your figures do not take account of the backup that's needed and the new infrastructure that's needed to bring solar and wind to the places where the energy is used. And so the true full-term cost of the whole wind and solar systems is being underestimated by those who are saying there's going to be a very rapid change. The facts will show, I'm afraid, that we can't move as fast as you're predicting. And that's where we're going to have to differ.
What do you mean we can't, Jeremy? What do you mean by we can't?
That the supply of materials for renewables, the manufacturing of them, the metals for them, the fact that China is so dominant in the supply of new materials for renewables, and the relationship between China and the US, China and the West, is at the moment in a very poor state. And Trump's tariffs are rather adding to that, so it will slow the whole process down. The fact that renewables so far have had $6, $7, $8 trillion invested in them, but by 2024 still only supplied 10% of total global energy needs, shows how huge the amounts of capital are going to be needed to get renewables going faster. I'm not arguing with Mark about the requirement for renewables. We want the world to run on non-carbon producing energy sources. It's absolutely essential. All I'm saying is that the facts are showing and will show that hydrocarbons are going to be used by governments whose economies have got to be their first priority, not climate change policy. So I'm ending this podcast by saying Mark and I need to come together where we agree. There needs to be an and approach to energy supply, not an either or. The oil and gas companies are going to be reinvesting in a change in the market where prices will rise to make it profitable for them to invest in new fields. And some of the capital suppliers are beginning to notice this, and that there will be a joint partnership between hydrocarbons and renewables for the next 10 or 20 years. But alas, the move to renewables will not be able to proceed as fast as Mark is describing.
So, Mark, we can't was there.
I think
that last phrase, a partnership, is that the way you see it happening, even if it's not quite what you would like?
I'm worried by, I don't think oil and gas companies or need to become renewable energy companies. I actually think 95% of the world's renewable energy has been installed by non-oil and gas companies, by private equity infrastructure funds typically. As for the scale and the speed, I think it's been quite extraordinary. It took, a decade for the first trillion to go into renewables, but only a couple of years for the second trillion to go in. And that's scaling up fast, mostly from Southeast Asia. I think that China is stealing a march on Europe and America, particularly in the global south, by selling cheap renewables. And I think it's the economics that win here. I think what the facts will show is that batteries plus renewables is cheaper than fossil fuels. The reason why energy prices are so high in the world, particularly in Europe, is because of gas. Renewable energy is some of the cheapest forms of energy. So much cheap energy in Scotland is coming on that at points the energy is virtually free. Europe has already seen hundreds, if not thousands of hours of free energy because there's so much of abundance of renewable energy. And that actually cuts the profitability of the traditional energy companies as we move to this new system. Now,
okay, but Mark, can I put the point that Jeremy made? Governments need oil to maintain growth, economic growth.
No, I don't think that's right at all. I just look at California. It's one of the biggest economies in the world. It's one of the most successful economies in the world. It's where all the interesting companies are. They've secured their growth without fossil fuels for most parts of the day. They're actually running themselves on renewable energy. Now, that has not affected their growth at all. I just wish British politicians were as imaginative as the leadership in California and the leaders in China, who can show that this can be done. This can be done at scale. This can be done very quickly. There's far more metals and metals to make renewable energy than we need. And the great thing about it, once you've extracted the critical minerals and the rare earths, this is infinitely recyclable. There will be a point in which rare earths will reach peak as we will be taking back the recyclable materials, and we'll have a circular economy within the energy system. And because we won't need the commodities of coal and oil and gas, we'll actually have infinitely cheap renewables from the sun. And I think that future generations, not this one, but future generations will be able to look forward to, a bit like with mobile phones. You used to pay monthly a charge, and every time you rang somebody, you paid for the phone call. Today, you've got all you can eat for £50 a month with your phone. I think the energy system will move to that. And I think the beneficiaries of this will be first the retail consumer. Unfortunately, industry which has very, very large energy needs in one place for chemicals and for paper and so on, and aluminium, that we're going to have to address in a slightly different way. But I think most of the displacement of fossil fuels will happen by renewables replacing gas in power and EVs replacing the internal combustion engine with the car. And we can actually do this very, very quickly, as China and as India and South Korea and Vietnam has shown us. I just wish that Europe were as quick to the mark as they've been in the East.
All right.
And yeah.
Mark, let's leave it there, because I want to give you each 30 seconds, the takeaway, the call to action for those watching this, who've been trying to follow this, who have been following it, helped by your graphics, because this has been a riveting discussion of so much you agree with, but also the differences. Jeremy, what's the takeaway you'd like to leave for people watching in 30 seconds, please?
The takeaway is that we need renewables in the system. Global energy requirements by the second half of this century must be more or less total non-carbon sources if we can. But it's still some way away. And Mark has not fully and truly described the years it will take for renewables to take oil and gas out of the system. Economies have got to go on working, and gas is particularly important for that. So the and approach to energy is going to be with us for another 30 years at least before we can assume that renewables can fully take over.
Mark, your pragmatic message on this?
I think the opposite, that renewables will happen far faster than we believe is possible. And we're going through the generation that is seeing this revolution. I'd like your listeners to follow the work of Carbon Tracker, but also my good friend Kingsmill Bonder Ember, Michael Liebreich, who founded Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and Asad Razouk from Gurin Energy, great specialists in the clean energy revolution. And their data and their analysis is underpinning the heart of the points I've been making today. Please dig in and read the research. I think the facts show that actually it's the renewable energy revolution, its cheapness and its speed that will allow us to actually change the way the energy system works and transportation works, but for the better. And it's going to come because of the success of these new innovative technologies.
Well, Mark Campanale, Jeremy Greenstock, thank you both very much indeed. This was a riveting insight into critical differences, but also important agreements about the transition or not away from fossil fuels, particularly on the timing, as you both have just expressed in your last remark. You can reference everything in a transcript of the podcast. It's posted in parallel on our website with contact details for us and both Jeremy and Mark. Do please keep up the spirit of conversation. That's what today has been about thinking the unthinkable. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, contribute. There you'll find all our podcasts very much in the same vein of frankness, originality, and what is happening over the cliff. From me, Nik Gowing, until the next time, keep thinking unthinkable. More than ever, it's possible and necessary. So from Jeremy, Mark, and me, bye-bye.